It's no surprise to anyone that professional fighters tend to be strange. Almost never does someone choose to make a living out of pummeling other human beings if they're normal and well-adjusted. To go through the history of elite fighters is to look at a long list of damaged people. Everyone struggles with something, whether it be addiction, violent outbursts, infidelity, or even outright criminal activity. However, some fighters have the misfortune of struggling against all of the above, and no matter how good they are in the ring or the octagon, it doesn't help much when it comes to handling their personal issues. This is the story of Jon Jones, the self-described bad guy trying to be a good guy. Born on the 19th of July, 1987, Jon had a rough upbringing. His father, Arthur Jones Jr., was an assistant pastor at a Pentecostal church where the family lived in Endicott, New York. His mother, Camille Jones, was also an active church member, besides being a nurse who cared for intellectually disabled people. As you can imagine, all of their kids were raised attending church every Sunday. Jon was the third of 4 children, his younger brother being Chandler Jones, who grew up to be a Super Bowl winning defensive end for the Las Vegas Raiders in the NFL, and his big brother being Arthur Jones III, a now retired defensive end who was also in the NFL. It is a massive understatement to say that their family's genetics are favorable for athleticism. One glaring omission from the Jones family lineup is their sister, Carmen Jones, who tragically passed at 17 years old after a 2-year-long fight with brain cancer. The siblings were all very close, and her passing only brought the brothers closer. According to Jon's brother, Chandler, the 3 brothers slept in the same bedroom, which resulted in the much too frequent occasion of a piece of furniture being broken due to them fighting each other. In somewhat of a genius move, their father solved this by buying a wrestling mat and putting it in their basement. Every day, the brothers would wrestle with each other for hours, which created a hyper-competitive environment in their household, with them competing to see who would do even menial things like drinking the most milk or opening the refrigerator the fastest. This led to Jon joining the wrestling team in the 7th grade, and ultimately becoming a wrestling champion at a very young age, along with his brother Arthur. But this prowess had its costs. Jon claims he was very sheltered by his parents and was never allowed to go over to any of his friends' houses, not even once. This made him hyper-focused on wrestling since it was pretty much the only thing he was allowed to do, and he never took time off from it, getting 3 seasons in a year, whereas other wrestlers would only get 1. Jon's exceptional comfort with the hazards that come with combat sports isn't surprising, considering that he actually had a history of going out of his way to expose himself to danger even as a kid. This proclivity led to a near-death experience when Jon was just 6 years old, when he decided to swim out beyond the point his parents had allowed him to. This resulted in him losing his footing and beginning to drown, only to be saved at the very last moment by someone who was going by on a boat and happened to notice him struggling to come back to the surface. But before I go any further, this video is brought to you by today's sponsor, Bespoke Post. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering a box of awesome top-shelf goods from under-the-radar brands. It's free to join and you can skip a month or cancel anytime. Every month, they introduce their members to cool new products, outdoor gear, barware, home and kitchen goods, clothing, and more. All you have to do is fill out a preference quiz and they'll let you know which boxes would best fit your personality. Every box has around $70 worth of goods inside, but costs you only a fraction of the value. You'll get a box assigned to you, and before it's shipped, you'll get a preview of what comes inside to decide if you'd like to keep it, swap it for a different box, or skip the month entirely for no charge. You only pay for what you actually want, and their lineup changes each month. This month, they sent me the Weekender, Chill, and Dram boxes. The Chill box has the super nice cooler in it, which holds 23 liters, is tear resistant up to 375 pounds, and honestly feels pretty nice. The Weekender box has the super nice travel bag inside of it, and a Dram contained a nice mixer for all of you whiskey heads out there, some flavored ice ball makers, these very nice whiskey glasses, and a field guide to whiskey. And 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are based right here in the United States. I'm no expert, but all this stuff feels very high quality, not even trolling you guys. To get 20% off your first box, click the link in the description and enter TurkeyTom20 at checkout, or go to bespokepost.com/turkeytom20. Okay, now back to the video. Not content with being a proficient wrestler during high school, Jon also got into football, and much like his brothers, played defense. It was during a stint as a football player that a coach gave him his nickname, Bones, after his slender frame. But despite being good at football, his passion was still in wrestling. By his senior year, he finally achieved his longtime goal of being the state champion of New York, which culminated in him being invited to the national championship. He finished in 4th place and attracted the attention of many colleges. However, due to his grades not being good enough for more prestigious schools, he was kept on as a wrestler wrestler for Iowa Central Community College. Eventually, he decided to transfer to Morrisville State College to study criminal justice. When asked about this decision, John said, "I was studying criminal justice and I wanted to be a law enforcement officer in my hometown. Endicott, New York, man. I thought it would be so cool to be a hometown police officer. I've always been a person who tries to do the right thing in life, for the most part. I'm no angel, but I was always the kid who snitched on the kids who had pot. I don't want to offend the pot smokers out there, but I was just kind of a snitch. I was just down for people doing the right thing. My parents kind of raised me to be a good guy. I've always been down with the good side, I guess." During his time at college, he was roommates with another student named Joe Soto, who actually went on to be a featherweight MMA champion. This is relevant because Soto dreamed of being an MMA fighter and would constantly watch YouTube videos of fights. Initially, Jones was put off by the prospect of being involved in an actual fight like that, thinking Joe to be crazy for being brave enough to want to do that. However, despite his hesitant attitude toward it, Jones began being drawn to MMA like a moth to a flame. And after absorbing Soto's obsession with watching fighting videos to the point of falling asleep to them, just 2 years after excelling at the national level as a wrestler, John made his professional MMA debut. Jones's sudden decision to start competing in MMA wasn't done on a whim. In 2007, his girlfriend Jessie Moses, whom he had met in high school 4 years prior, had become pregnant. Because of this, John said he was determined to do his best to already be an established fighter by the time his first child was born. Though his trainers tried to shoot down the notion that he would quickly find a footing when it came to making a career out of fighting, saying that it could take a long time before he became successful, Jones refused to listen, believing instead that he could make it into the UFC with just a few solid wins under his belt. Later on, history would prove Jones not just correct, but deadly accurate. Within 9 months of MMA training, John goes through his first 6 fights effortlessly, defeating all of his opponents with dominance. However, even this early on in his career, we can see certain behavior patterns rear their head that John would later become infamous for. His second fight, which was against Brazilian fighter Carlos Eduardo, and the longest out of his first 6, saw John initially getting frustrated with Carlos's ability to keep hold of his leg. While it's completely debatable if it was intentional or not, as soon as the hold was dissolved, John launched what seemed to be a deliberate knee to Carlos's balls. While it would take a long time for his reputation as a dirty fighter to solidify, the reasons for it were always around. His 6-fight run concluded with a bout against Moises Gabin that won Jones the USKBA Light Heavyweight Championship, and it attracted the attention of the UFC. Within just a month, he was slated to fight Andre Guzmão, a fight he took on only 2 weeks' notice, after Andre's original opponent, Tomas Drawl, dropped out.
Short black trunks for Jones, white trunks for Guzmão.
Or black guy Jones, white guy Guzmão.
That was said by Joe Rogan.
Regardless, he won by unanimous decision. After 2 more victories where he further established the spinning back elbow as one of his signature moves, Jones was signed to the UFC for 4 more fights, only to suffer his first and only loss, which went on to be one of the most controversial losses in the history of the UFC. While demolishing Matt Hamill with elbow strikes, the fight ended in the first round with Matt tapping, only for the referee to later declare Matt the winner via disqualification. As it turns out, the ref intended to just deduct a point from John as he was throwing downward elbow strikes, called 12-6 elbows, which are illegal. But upon doing so, he noticed the fight could not continue due to the damage Matt suffered being too great, as Jones had dislocated his shoulder while slamming him on the mat. The ref, not knowing that Matt Hamill was deaf, asked him if he was done, which he obviously didn't reply to, adding to the confusion. Because the fight couldn't continue, the illegal elbow strikes resulted in Jones being disqualified altogether. Well, that's already controversial enough on its own. It becomes even more absurd when you factor in why 12-6 elbow strikes are illegal. When the UFC rules were being settled, the representatives present had seen videos of people breaking bricks and blocks of ice with 12-6 elbow strikes, which scared them into thinking that particular strike was lethal. Not only was this disputed due to the multitude of videos of people breaking ice and bricks with kicks or even punches that are completely legal, but the 12-6 elbow strikes that John was dealing were also striking Matt's face and not the top of his head, which was what the rule initially concerned. Regardless of the debate surrounding this moment, Jones went on to win another 3 fights, including one in which he broke his opponent's face in 3 places with an elbow strike. After his last fight, Jones was considering what was next for him. Already at this point, he saw him move to the heavyweight division as a possibility, since he'd frequently dwarf his opponents in the light heavyweight division with his 6'4" height. But that was still a distant prospect for him, as he was more interested in fighting the top 3 in light heavyweight, which included the champion at the time, Mauricio Shogun Rua. By a fateful accident, Rashad Evans, John's training partner who was slated to fight Rua for the title, suffered a knee injury during training, meaning John would be streamlined into the exact title fight he was looking for. By March 19th, 2011, Jon Jones made history, defeating Rua by TKO and becoming the youngest UFC champion ever. Just hours before the fight, Jones and two of his coaches were headed for the Great Falls Historic Park, where John intended to meditate. As soon as they were dropped off by the river, however, their plans changed as they noticed an elderly couple screaming for help. According to John's retelling, a drug addict had smashed their car's window and stolen their GPS. John's coaches immediately took off after the man and John followed suit, culminating in the three successfully apprehending him and returning the couple's GPS. There's actually a video of Dana White sharing the story with Joe Rogan.
But me and you gotta talk about this on a thing. I went to meditate at the park. Some lady yells, "Help, I've been robbed." Chases the fucking guy a mile. Fucking lead kicks him from behind, gets on top of him, figure fours him until the fucking police come. When?
What?
15 minutes ago.
What?
Jon Jones is a goddamn superhero.
It must have been a pretty effective way for John to get ready for the fight against Rua, since his performance on fight night was staggering. John began the fight with a flying knee, and over the course of the 3 rounds, he broke Rua down with everything he had in his arsenal, including more of his trademarked malicious techniques, like kicks to the knee and walking at his opponent with his lead hand open to cover the opponent's face and potentially poke him in the eye. What's particularly impressive is that John didn't just perform well, but dominated in a fight against the champion. On top of that, the fight didn't finish on a decision or an irregular TKO with the ref waving it, but with Rua tapping out, which is extremely rare when the fight isn't on the ground. Even by UFC standards, this was an unusually brutal match. His first title defense was supposed to be against Rashad Evans, his aforementioned training partner who dropped out of his fight with Rua. The fight was even signed off for UFC 133, but it was quickly called off as Jones claimed he had suffered a hand injury that required surgery. The only thing is, John opted for physical therapy instead of surgery, which was already suspicious on its face. But as the history between the two as training partners was diligently dug up, it was all but confirmed that John had faked his injury to get out of the fight, as Rashad was theorizing. Not only had they promised never to fight each other since they both came from Greg Jackson's training camp, but John outright alluded to it in the past. When asked about fighting a teammate, John said, "I'm against it. The only reason being is I'm a Jackson fighter. I just think there are lots of ways around it. You know, you could fake injuries, you could do anything. I mean, there's just so many ways around it, you know? But before I joined the team, that was the first conversation we had. It was just about friendship." Whether this was about friendship or just Jones being hesitant about fighting someone who not only had already defeated some stellar opponents, but knew the ins and outs of John's training was called into question. Meanwhile, Rashad himself was very upset the fight had been signed off on by John in the first place in contradiction to his previous statements. Even more, he was angry at their coach, Greg Jackson, who gave John the okay, and then decided not to have anything to do with coaching either fighter, saying, "You can't say you're not going to have anything to do with it when you're a big part of the reason why the situation originated. That's like spilling a glass of milk and then walking away and saying you don't want to have anything to do with it. You spill the milk, so you're at least going to help clean it up, right?" When Jon Jones came to the gym over a year ago, Greg Jackson came to me and said, "Listen, what do you feel about having this kid on the team?" I told him straight up that I didn't like it. I told him that the kid was talented and that the sky was the limit with him, but that was the type of guy I wanted to fight, not train with. Greg came back saying, "He will be just like a brother." I still told him that I didn't want to do that. Then Greg said if that situation ever did arise between Jones and me, he would have to turn the fight down because that's how it works. He would have to turn down the fight with me so that way I wouldn't be put in a position where I looked like a punk. That's how it works in the Greg Jackson system. After a while, Greg was so high on this kid coming in, and I met Jon Jones, and he was a very nice and very sweet kid, so eventually I said screw it, let's bring him in. John and I were clicking on another level, almost like I did with my first training partner. We would share ideas, and I wasn't holding back on him, and I felt that he wasn't holding back on me. I did my best to help, and I really felt that our friendship was on another level, but that wasn't the case. When the first opportunity came, and he said that he would fight me if Dana said so, that to me stung more than anything. He said that he didn't want to lose his job, and look man, the UFC isn't going to fire anyone because they're turning down fights. If anything, it would mess up future opportunities for them, and they weren't going to come to him and say, "If you don't fight Rashad, you're kicked out of the UFC." That wasn't going to happen. I was always considerate and respectful to our system, because if I had the belt, I would want you to do the same for me. Rashad went on to explain that, even after John had answered interviews confirming the fight would happen, he should have at least given him the heads up about it. Both Jones and Rashad had already mentioned the possibility of moving to different weight classes in case a fight between them was inevitable. But before any of those possibilities were explored, he got the news that their fight fight was on. Well, that is until the fight was canceled due to Jones's claim that he'd injured his hand. If that was John's attempt at last-minute reparations and trying to do good by his promise to Rashad, it didn't work, as the bridges between the Jackson training camp were burned for good by the time he got around to it. While he was initially expected to not fight again until the last quarter of 2011, people were mildly surprised to discover John had once again been slated to defend his title, this time against Quinton Rampage Jackson. Unlike Jones, Rampage had multiple losses on his record, the most recent one dealt by John's ex-training partner, Evans. But this fact made him no less terrifying of an opponent. According to John himself, throughout his entire career as an MMA fighter, the only person he ever faced that genuinely intimidated him was Rampage. Partly because when John was younger, he looked up to Rampage like a big brother. One noticeable sign of this is that during stare-downs, John usually looks right past his opponent. He tried to do that with Rampage, only to immediately avert his eyes back to him when they got close. In the lead up to the fight, John had recurring nightmares that Rampage knocked him out cold in the first round, no matter how many different strategies he tried. The solution he and his team came up with to counter this was for John to start the fight in a way he never did in his dreams. Right before going out to the octagon on fight night, John had a deep meditative prayer, which culminated in him having something akin to a hallucination wherein he was covered in feathers, and for some reason, he felt he became much faster. When the fight began, Jones followed his plan and opened by crawling toward Rampage, which disturbed both him and everyone watching the fight. But regardless of how odd of a way to begin a fight that was, it ultimately earned him the win, as he submitted Rampage with a rear naked choke in the 4th round. The first time a John Jones fight ever made it to the 4th round, as well as the first time Rampage had ever lost a fight via submission. Regardless of having won the fight, however, it once again attracted negative attention for the techniques he liked to use. Years later, Rampage commented on John's style, saying specifically that whenever someone did something effective against John, the response was usually an eye poke, a kick to the knee with the intention to hyperextend and injure the person he was fighting, or a spinning back elbow that tended to land on the back of the head, which, though illegal in the UFC, rarely results in a point deduction unless done excessively. The knee kick in specific was cited by Rampage as something that damaged his knee irreversibly. Jones's infamy, both for being a dirty fighter and not being the nice guy he presented himself as during interviews, continued to grow. Once again, a fight between John and Rashad was being considered, but due to a hand injury the latter had recently suffered in his fight against Tito Ortiz, Jones was matched up with former light heavyweight champion Lyoto Machida. Despite being shorter and 9 years older than John, and having lost to both Rua and Rampage before, Machida gave John an extraordinarily tough first round. For the first time, John appeared to be genuinely outmatched when it came to striking, as he missed most of his kicks and even got caught a few times with counterpunches that badly staggered him, a sight almost completely unforeseen. While Jones's fight against Rampage involved a lot of endurance, his fight against Lyoto was orienting himself towards technical striking, with Machida taking the lead. However, in the second round, after a few more frustrated attempts at outstriking Machida, John shifted gears into his wrestling, and at that point, the fight was pretty much over. After scoring a big takedown and cutting Machida's face with an elbow, John finished him with a guillotine choke. Yet again, he submitted a fighter who had never been submitted before, this time in a particularly brutal way, as he choked Lyoto out while they stood against the fence and then dropped his unconscious body on the mat. Following another successful title defense, John and Rashad Evans were finally forced to meet each other in the octagon. At this point, Rashad had already been instigating conflict with John for the better part of a year due to his perceived betrayal, which culminated in Evans switching his training camp. Evans' provocations typically revolved around the time they spent training together, with Rashad claiming to know the secret to beating Jones due to how many times he dominated John during training, with particular emphasis on one occasion in which he held Jones down while they wrestled. When asked about Rashad's claims, John said, "We first met in 2009, and I don't even remember when we started training together. We stopped by the beginning of 2011. I wouldn't even say we were never friends. We went to dinner once and probably trained with each other 8 or 9 times. It's really overblown. People are acting like he taught me to fight and that we had friendship bracelets. Some days he would get me, some days I'd get him. We shared little psychological tips. At the time, he was the number 2 contender and I wasn't even a contender. The one day he dominated me, it wasn't like I was thinking, this is defining who I am. He was on top of me. I never thought it'd come back and be used against me. I'm glad he talks about the time he kept me down, but I've totally eliminated through hours and hours of work his ability to ever do that again. My game face is a lot different than my practice face. I've never intended to hurt a teammate and I've only knocked out one of them. He held me down. That's not knocking me out. It's not a test of my cardio. It just affects the time clock. Yeah, you got me. You won't do it again." Rashad says these things hoping I'll focus on the pre-fight hype rather than tactics, but my mind, body, and spirit are all in the gym. Said and done, their fight wasn't particularly eventful. John proceeded to wobble and beat Rashad over the course of 5 rounds, winning by unanimous decision. Having defended his belt against against pretty much every significant challenger in his division, some of Jon's past opponents were being considered for a rematch. Lyoto Machida was ruled the #1 contender at the time, because right after his fight against Jon, he knocked out Ryan Bader in the second round. Jon was asked about potentially revisiting their fight, to which he replied, "He was my lowest pay-per-view draw of last year. No one wants to see me fight Lyoto Machida. Lyoto is a high risk and low reward. He's a tough fighter, but no one wants to buy that fight. Between Shogun, Rampage, and Rashad, Lyoto was my lowest draw. Why would I want to fight someone where it's a lose-lose situation? I won't make money on it, and he's a tricky fighter." Some people saw this quote from Jones as a violation of the unspoken rules of the UFC, not only admitting that the money is what makes the fights, but that he outright doesn't want to fight against someone who, by his own judgment, could potentially win, or at least make Jon struggle to win. This is at a time when the UFC was suffering from the absence of their two biggest fighters. George St. Pierre had sustained a knee injury and went on a hiatus to heal, and Brock Lesnar had gone back to WWE. Ideally, Jones would step up to play the role of the fearless undefeated champion, but it seems he didn't care at all how his straightforward attitude regarding how he picked fights could be counterproductive PR-wise. This is important because the UFC wasn't the only thing struggling with its PR. Jones was as well. After continuous growth of his reputation as someone who only pretended to be nice and well-adjusted, Jones was arrested for a DUI after he totaled his Bentley by crashing into a pole, getting his driver's license suspended for 6 months. This was just the first of many of Jon's run-ins with the law. Regardless of this, his outright willingness to refuse a fight if it wasn't in his interest would soon get him in a heap of trouble. During the Rashad Evans post-fight press conference, Jones's next fight was said to be against Dan Henderson in UFC 151. Dan, like Jon, came from a wrestling background, and perhaps because of this, Jon's training camp was preparing to take the fight to the ground, where Jon would have an advantage. Besides that, Henderson was a whopping 17 years older than Jon, which further suggested the fight wouldn't be very difficult. But 18 days prior to UFC 151, Dan pulled out of the fight due to having sustained a knee injury. As is customary when a fighter pulls out, the UFC scrambled for a last-minute replacement. After calling every single fighter available, everybody turned the fight down, probably due to how little time they had to train and how threatening an opponent Jon Jones was. That is, everybody but one man, Chael Sonnen, who not only accepted the challenge, but said he would fly to Las Vegas the same night to fight Jones. Mind you, Chael is a middleweight, while Jon is on the heavy side of light heavyweight, meaning the fight would have to be a catchweight fight with a massive difference in size between the two fighters, all of which makes Sonnen's willingness to fight all the more impressive. But much to the chagrin of pretty much everyone, Jones turned down the fight. Not only was this completely unforeseen coming from a reigning champion without an injury or greater reason, but it also meant that the event would be canceled altogether since its main card would be missing. It's important to note that as of late 2012, Jon Jones was the first mixed martial artist ever to be sponsored by Nike on an international scale, meaning if the UFC was to have someone as its face, it was going to be him. Everything was set up for Jon to be the Michael Jordan of the sport, but his refusal to take the fight was a massive letdown for the fans, the other fighters on the card, as well as the UFC itself as an enterprise. President of the UFC, Dana White, had some choice words to say about the decision.
This is probably one of my all-time lows as being president of the UFC over the last 11 years. For the first time in 11 years, we're going to cancel an event. One of the things that you guys have heard me brag about a million times is how UFC doesn't have to cancel events. We can always find a replacement. For somebody to fight Jon Jones on 8 days' notice is tough to do. But to be totally honest with you guys, one guy did. Not only when I called him did he say, "I'll take the fight," he said, "I'll fly to Las Vegas tonight and fight him." And that was Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen accepted the fight with Jon Jones, wanted the fight bad. So as of, 8, 9 o'clock last night, we had a fight. We here at the UFC started working, started creating different commercials. PR started getting ready to crank up. I was going to do this call, and this was obviously going to be a much different call this morning. But the one thing that I never thought in a million years would happen, happened. Jon Jones said, "I'm not fighting Chael Sonnen with 8 days notice." Again, something that's never happened in UFC history. A guy who's a world champion and considered one of the pound-for-pound best turns down a fight. When he and I talk, he says, "I got to sit down and talk to my coaches." His coach, Greg Jackson, says, "There's no way you take this fight. This fight. You don't take this fight on 8 days' notice. It would be the biggest mistake of your entire career." Wow. Chael Sonnen's a 185-pounder who wants to move up to 205, who hasn't trained a day for this fight, and the fight's in 8 days, yet he says he'll fly here tonight to fight the supposed pound-for-pound third best fighter in the world champion, And you have so much, I mean, how much faith do you have in your champion and your guy? Now, I literally just bumped into Greg Jackson the other day, and I was kind of joking around about some of the things he said. I'll tell you what, I'll go on the record saying, this guy is a sport killer, okay? This guy's from another planet. I don't give a what Greg Jackson thinks. Guy's a weirdo, man. Are you kidding me? If he takes the fight with Chael Sonnen, it'd be the biggest mistake of his entire career because he's not ready for that guy. Greg Jackson should never be interviewed by anybody ever again except for a psychiatrist. So right now what's happening is this fight is canceled. It'll be John Jones versus Lyoto Machida, Saturday, September 22nd on the Toronto, Canada card at UFC 152. I can tell you this right now, he ain't turning down the Machida fight. If I get a call today that says he doesn't want to fight Machida, I'll have another media call, and it won't be good.
All in all, this was an extremely controversial moment for John. To this day, it's not exactly clear why he pulled out. When asked about it, he said, "I don't regret the decision. I pretty much had everything to lose in that situation. Chael Sonnen is a guy whose record is, I think, 6-5, which isn't a very good record to even fight for a world title. I just thought it would be a bad decision to give a guy the opportunity of a lifetime like that. It all seemed too suspicious that he was calling me out way before I had a clue my opponent was hurt. People don't realize Chael Sonnen and Dan Henderson are actually best friends. Chael Sonnen knew his teammate was hurt. He had prepared up to 3 weeks for me. That would give me 8 days when he had 3 weeks. It's odd that John simultaneously downplays how much of a threat Chael was, while theorizing that Chael knew about the injury and had 3 weeks of training as if it were a threatening advantage. Presuming John had also been training, this really shouldn't be the case. However, just a year prior, Chael had fought a very close fight against Anderson Silva, a legend of the sport that held John's admiration. So it's not entirely out of the question that he did indeed see Chael in the same way he saw Lyoto, someone who, even if most likely was going to lose, could give him significant trouble. Speaking of Lyoto, by trying to avoid Chael, John landed himself right in a rematch against him in UFC 152, which was slated to take place in September and thus would give John Jones plenty of time to train. However, the fight was set up without Lyoto's consent, and upon finding out that the fight was already being promoted, he declined it. As a replacement, John was slated to defend his title against Vitor Belfort. Vitor was 10 years older than John and had a background in boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and this was such a good matchup against John's unorthodox striking and wrestling that many people were happy that this fight happened instead of John versus Lyoto or Sonnen. Still, the odds were heavily in the favor of John, as people didn't think Vitor had much of a chance. Much to their surprise, he came very close to either getting John to submit or breaking his arm right in the first round, as he managed to get him in an armbar. But with some grueling effort, John managed to get out of it, and after 3 more rounds, punctuated by John's vicious knee kicks and one almost successful attempt at a triangle against John, he managed to submit Vitor. This marks John's 4th consecutive title defense, and not against random contenders, but only the very best people in his division at the time. However, Belfort had successfully injured John's elbow in that armbar attempt in the first round, and because of that, John's immediate future was unsure as he had to take some downtime to recover. Ever since the fight with Chael was slated to happen for less than a day, the bout that never was became a phantom that haunted John Jones. Whether because the UFC overlords decided it was going to be, regardless of what Jones personally wanted, or because the fans were asking for it, after Jones beat Belfort, the next thing on the chopping block was having the Jones versus Sonnen fight materialize. In order to hype it up, they had John coaching opposite sides with Chael on the 17th season of The Ultimate Fighter. This is a move they frequently did, having fighters who are supposed to face off in the near future coaching Ultimate Fighter to create moments of conflicts that will inevitably attract attention and generate hype. They had done this with great success to hype up Chael's fight against Wanderlei Silva, with the two getting in a scuffle that became extremely popular. Given how prone Sonnen was to relentlessly bad-mouthing his opponents, it seemed like a done deal. But John Jones had a different idea. John still very much believed the fight to be unworthy of having his name attached to it, let alone promoting it. So he made no efforts to antagonize Chael and went out of his way to look past Sonnen's antics. This strategy ultimately proved effective, as not only did Chael fail to bring out the defensive champ with a chip on his shoulder attitude out of Jones, he and John actually became friendly with each other. On top of that, Chael was actually humanized, which severely detracted from his cartoonishly villainous bad guy act. Well, it's a very interesting piece of media to watch, especially now that years have gone by and we can look at it retrospectively. At the time, it must have been a nightmare for whatever team of people was responsible for promoting John and Chael's fight, since there was no marketable enmity between the two. And the one potential selling point, Chael's gimmick, was deconstructed. During interviews and pre-fight press conferences, Chael tried his best to do what he usually does, giving us hilarious moments such as this one.
You're looking pretty big. Tell me, what are you walking around at?
Joe, I don't promote fights. I pick fights. I'm better than John Jones. I'm better than Sean Combs. I am even better than John Holmes.
John Holmes is a dead junkie, and Sean Combs is like a rapper. Is that the other guy?
Don't bring up old business. The course is current events. FX Ultimate Fighter just before Justified Tuesday night.
But the entire promotion hit a brick wall whenever the time came for Jones to meet Sonnen's energy halfway. What's worse, UFC 159 was supposed to be the most commercial event of the year for the company, and Jones was actively underselling it at every opportunity he got. For example, in the few instances Jones actually addressed his fight with Chael, he said, "The beautiful thing about Chael is that he uses his words and that's all he has, really. He's just a gang of quotes that no one's going to remember. He's weak in every way, shape, or form. He taps before submissions are even sunk in. I could put one hand around his throat and he's probably going to tap. Chael's mouth doesn't bother me at all. I think if I was to take it personal, if I wasn't to understand it, it would bother me. But I have a pretty clear understanding of who Chael is, what he's accomplished, and my understanding kind of takes the power away from his words and his persona. You can see that the talk has picked up a little bit, but Chael is in the promote fight business. I guess that's how he got in this situation in the first place. I'm in the remain champion business. It's definitely safe to say this is one of those fights that's for the fans. Chael doesn't have the greatest record, but he has a huge following. He's a statement maker, and people like to see him compete. Whereas some fighters either play up the threat of whoever they'll go up against or downplay it so excessively that people tune in to see if their trash talking gets backed up, Jones did the worst thing he could do, which is treating it basically like it was an exhibition. People made the point that promoting the fight meant that John would ultimately make more money, but it consistently fell on deaf ears. The cherry on top of all of this is that Sonnen had recently been caught with elevated testosterone levels due to TRT, which at the time was a hotly discussed topic. While John remained mostly silent otherwise, he decided to weigh in on it, saying that it was a good thing that the UFC was cracking down on performance-enhancing drugs and attacked Chael for getting caught. The irony of this would only be revealed later. As was expected, fight night came, and Jones did his best to do to Chael Sonnen what Chael Sonnen used to do to other fighters, which was to immediately put constant pressure on his opponent and not let up until he got the win. While this did earn John a TKO before the end of the first round, it also mangled his big toe in such an abhorrent way, I can't even show it to you right now. Because of how much weight he was putting on his foot to take Chael down, it snapped his big toe right in the middle. It also meant that if Sonnen had lasted for a measly 30 more seconds, he would have won over Jones in a doctor stoppage, as there was no way Jones could have continued the fight with that injury. Fast forward to 2013, and as Jones healed from his annihilated toe, light heavyweight top 10 contender Alexander Gustafsson was slated to fight Gegard? Really? That's a fucking name? That is a name. Holy shit. Alexander Gustafsson was slated to fight Gegard Mousasi, but Gegard wasn't medically cleared, which landed Gustafsson in a bout against Jones for September. After a completely uneventful lead-up with a mostly friendly approach to the battle from both sides, with one glaring exception being when Alexander called John a brat in a Swedish interview, this fight was proven to be one of the most dramatically undersold fights of all time. The promotion found nothing to market it on besides the fact that Alexander, unlike many of John's opponents up to this point, was as young and as tall as John is. The fight went the distance, which was a rarity for both fighters. Throughout its 5 rounds, John found himself consistently not just outboxed, but unable to use his wrestling as much as he'd like, which was something completely novel. Right in the first round, Alexander cut John right above the eyebrow, and over the course of the fight, the cut got so bad that the ringside doctor was looking to end it. Luckily for John, that didn't happen, and after having to depend solely on his kicking prowess, he finally got his trademark spinning back elbow in and scored his one and only takedown against Alexander, but only after Alexander had beat him to the punch, getting Jones down for the first time in his entire career. By the end of it, both fighters were absolutely demolished and immediately had to be taken to the hospital, but John won his toughest fight ever by unanimous decision. It was ruled not only fight of the night, but fight of the year. This came timely as John had just gotten sponsored by Gatorade and Muscle Tech, 2 of the biggest sports adjacent brands. John had just broken the record of light heavyweight title defenses, but a rematch was already being forced by the UFC. This is when Jones's fight picking tendencies rear their head again, as he chose to postpone the rematch, which would have easily been a million pay-per-view bout, to instead fight Glover Teixeira. To say fans were disappointed is an understatement, but because John held so much weight in his division, he had enough leverage to pick who he fought. Many people speculated his decision to avoid an immediate revisitation of his fight against Gustafsson was due to how uncomfortable it made him to look vulnerable in the octagon. Another reason for the disappointment was that, though Glover was certainly no pushover, he was yet another fighter that was significantly older than John. In one instance, a fan began tagging Jones, claiming he was ducking Alexander, only for John to go on said fan's profile and start commenting on every post of his, accusing him of being gay. Of course, following some thorough backlash, John and his manager claimed the account had been hacked and that Jones had lost his phone. This is odd since a picture was uploaded to John's Instagram during the time he supposedly didn't have his phone with him, but despite this, the controversy was laid to rest and the focus was back on John's match with Teixeira. While Glover is certainly a talented fighter, as signified by the fact that he had become the light heavyweight champion at a whopping 42 years old just a couple of years ago, he was no match for John. After multiple reschedulings, John beat Glover badly, finishing the fight ahead by 5 points on every scorecard. Once again, eyes were drawn to his excruciatingly vicious dirty wrestling, as he tore a ligament in Glover's shoulder in the very first round, an injury that he is still dealing with to this day. He also had his hand on Glover's face and blatantly poked him in the eye, which was confusingly cruel since he was already winning the fight and had no reason to resort to such tactics. To make matters worse, after the fight, John posted a video to his Instagram where he mocked people who were criticizing him for poking his opponents in the eye. Though it was deleted right after, the internet never forgets, and it was clear to everyone in the audience that, unlike how the UFC was trying to spin it, the poking was not accidental, and John had no intention of stopping either. By June 2014, when talks of a Gustafsson rematch were peaking again as Alexander had just won another fight, Dana White said the obvious. Just to clear up a couple of things, people think we're in contract negotiations with John Jones. We're not. What we're doing right now is trying to get him to sign the bout agreement for Gustafsson. He doesn't want to fight Gustafsson. Lorenzo and I have a meeting with Jones on Thursday to get him to sign the bout agreement, and he's asking to fight Cormier instead. So there it is, as explicitly put as could be. Daniel Cormier weighed in on this pivot of Jones to a fight against him. So obviously this might benefit me in the long run, and if Jones really believes that I would be the tougher fight, then he would be doing it for the right reason. But if he's saying he wants to fight me because he believes I'd be an easier guy, man, I don't know. That's not good. There's good reason to think John preferred Daniel over Alexander because he'd be the easier one to fight. Daniel was 5 inches shorter, 9 years older, and he used to fight in the heavyweight division, which meant he was probably not going to be able to match John's speed. Although he did have a stellar background in wrestling, he wasn't as proficient in striking as Gustafsson, meaning he certainly wouldn't give John as much trouble. Ultimately, despite the UFC's best efforts to have Jones versus Gustafsson 2 take place, Alexander sustained a knee injury, which meant John will get the fight he wanted against Cormier. Despite me just mentioning how DC would have been the easier fight for John, I mean in no way to downplay how much of an excellent fighter he is. Prior to his fight against Jones, Daniel Cormier fought Dan Henderson, a match he didn't just win, but made it look like Dan had banana peels taped to his feet, which is insane considering how heavy he is. The closer the fight between DC and Jones came to materializing, the more information came out about them having some kind of long-standing feud that went mostly unspoken. Years prior, the two had an argument in the backstage of UFC 121, which DC recalled as John going out of his way to claim he could out-wrestle him, while John recalled it as just a playful attempt to break the ice. Besides another instance where the two butted heads about the UFC 121 incident and the occasional sniping, they remained at a safe distance from each other. That is, until their fight was officially on. John began antagonizing DC almost immediately, and in ways he hadn't ever done to any other opponent of his. Well, at least not publicly. From sending him DMs saying things like, "come to daddy," to telling him to shut up when he was just promoting the fight, in ways a lot less insulting than previous opponents have, by the way. This conflict came to a head in a brawl the two had during a stare down after Daniel shoved John. While this beef was already well on its way to becoming a sideshow to their actual fight, it was actually the conference the two held the next day that marked their conflict with each other. When asked how he felt regarding the brawl, John said,
"You know what, first of all, I'd like to give an apology to the MGM Grand and all the fans, all the kids who saw that.
So fake. It's so fake.
Definitely not proud of what happened today, but what happened was we had a face-off, and in the UFC it's very common to see two athletes get very close in their face-offs. Our heads touch, our nose rubs together. It's a very intimate, very passionate moment for a lot of fighters. I've actually never had a fighter put his hands on me by squeezing my throat. I reacted in self-defense by beating up Daniel.
Throughout the entire interview, John Jones maintained his usual media face and tone as he apologized for what had happened. Little did the people watching the broadcast know that this was part of his mind game against DC, and as soon as the cameras were off, or at least when he thought they were, his entire attitude and persona shifted, as if he became a different person. This shift had been alluded to before by people John had fought, but this is the very first time it was caught on camera and eventually found its way to the internet.
John, can you hear that, John?
Oh, you got your ass whipped today, buddy.
No, I didn't. You're a pussy.
Oh, yeah, you did it. I had you on
You're
your back.
such a little
I had
oh
you
my
on your
God.
back. I had you on your back. You suck, bro.
You're such a little
felt so weak. I'm glad to know that.
You're tiny. I'm like, this dude sucks.
Everybody say you're so strong. You're weak.
Okay.
You're a little fat.
You're a John.
Oh my God, you're so weak.
First off, you hit like a if you even hit me.
Yeah. I hit like a but I didn't hit you. You didn't.
You didn't, because I didn't even feel it.
Oh man.
I felt Melky's punch more than yours, you little fucking punk.
Oh yeah, you're so mad. I can hear it in your voice.
When UFC fans saw this, it was like seeing a cryptid. The fact that even his voice changed added a lot of weight to the theory that John's public image was a complete front. Though he continued to try and keep up his act, for whatever reason, DC kept bringing that side of John out.
You said you could take me down 100 times out of 100 times, right? And that's what you're gonna do, right? I challenge you to get me down 5 times in that 5-round fight. You won't be able to do that. Maybe you will get me down once. I believe in my whole heart that I'll get you down too. But the difference is, when I get you down, your face will open up. There is nothing you can do to stop me from coming at you round after round with the most malicious techniques I know. You will lose this fight, Daniel Cormier. I want you to believe it. Every ounce of training you put in leading up to this fight will be a waste of your life.
In the meantime, both fighters were issued fines and community service as a punishment for their scuffle during the stare down. And after John's sponsorship deal with Nike came to an end, he signed another one, this time with Reebok. Finally, the time came for the two to meet each other in the octagon, and though the lead up to the fight was extremely entertaining, the fight went as expected, with Jones winning by unanimous decision. The fight was far from the domination we've come to expect from Jones' fights, but more of a long-winded wrestling match, with John consistently at a slight but noticeable advantage. Initially, Daniel Cormier was getting somewhere with his boxing, which is pretty impressive considering how much shorter his reach is compared to John's. However, John eventually adjusted, and by the third round, the fight slowed down as the two got tired and wrestled more than anything else. This was a desirable outcome for John, who presumably focused his training on wrestling to prove a point to DC, that, despite him being an Olympian gold medalist, John could indeed out-wrestle him, as he jokingly said back in 2010. John was the first fighter to ever take DC down, and though DC did manage to take him down in the 5th round, it was too little too late. The fight was over, but the feud between the two was far from it. Daniel disliked Jones for being fake, while Jones resented DC for breaking his nice guy image almost without trying. In a way, they mirrored each other. Jones bent over backward to act normal and conceal his more vicious tendencies, but he constantly failed to do so, while Daniel Cormier tried his best to meet John's energy and meanness, only to repeatedly reveal how much of a plain, regular guy he was. Part of why this rivalry is iconic is how mismatched the two are with their respective energies.
I wish they would let me next door so I could spit in your f***ing face.
You know I would absolutely kill you if you ever did something like that,
You
right?
could never kill me.
Oh, I bet you I could.
Then you should try, John. You really should try, John.
No, I would literally kill you if you spit in my face.
Yeah, let's try that, John.
Literally kill you.
Let's try that, John.
I'm not saying I would fight you. I said I would kill you if
John,
you did some
do you
stupid
think
shit like that.
so John, do you think I'm just gonna sit there and let you kill me, John? I mean, really?
But after the fireworks with the confines of the UFC ended, the issues in John's personal life began taking the spotlight, as immediately after the fight came the news that Jones had tested positive for cocaine and entered rehab. This would be an omen of things to come. While the narrative John started out with hinged on him having never done it before and randomly getting caught after his one-time mistake, eventually he came clean and admitted he'd done it quite a few times before. In the episode of the Joe Rogan Experience he participated in, he mentioned that throughout his entire career he had a psychological crutch, which was to party in the lead up to the fight so that, in the case he lost, he had an excuse for it. After his one night in rehab, John was back to usual programming, and unfortunately, that meant he hadn't dealt with the issues he had so badly needed to. Just 3 months later, Jones found himself in trouble again, and this time a much more serious kind. On the morning of April 26, a silver Buick SUV ran a red light and crashed into 2 other cars, one of which was being driven by a 25-year-old pregnant woman who had her arm broken by the accident. The suspect allegedly left his car, checked to see the damage, went back to his car, retrieved cash from the vehicle, then fled the scene on foot. An off-duty police officer witnessed the incident and identified the suspect as John Jones. Later on, the paperwork of the SUV revealed it was a rental car under the name of Jonathan Jones. Last but not least, a pipe with marijuana in it was found in the car. While the charge was initially going to be a misdemeanor, the fact John fled the scene made it a felony. An arrest warrant was issued, and Jones turned himself in, but only to promptly post bail. At the time the situation was first developing, John was slated to fight against Anthony Johnson at UFC 187, but once he was thoroughly confirmed to have been behind the crash, he was stripped of his title due to violating the UFC's athlete conduct policy. Additionally, he lost his sponsorship deals with Reebok and Muscle Tech. This whole ordeal was particularly incendiary for a myriad of reasons. For one, in 2003, Daniel Cormier lost his 3-month-old daughter in a car accident caused by a reckless driver. Though this element is rarely mentioned, it definitely played into the moral aspect of their beef. Jones himself was a father of 3 at this point, still regularly partying to the point where he endangered the life of a pregnant woman. Thankfully, the woman who was injured suffered no complications, and after pleading guilty, John was sentenced to up to 18 months of probation and 72 appearances for charity and youth outreach in order to not get a felony on his record. During his time away from the UFC, John seemed to be truly dedicated to getting his act together, but his problems weren't limited to outside the octagon. In the same test that discovered the cocaine in his system, his testosterone was found to be unusually low, which could be consistent with someone who was cycling steroids. However, at the time it didn't get much attention, and ultimately nothing came of it. As John's fighting career resumed in late 2015, he was initially supposed to have a rematch with DC in April 2016. You see, while John was out for the count, DC went on to beat Anthony Johnson, the guy John was supposed to fight before his hit and run, and Alexander Gustafsson, the guy who gave John his toughest fight. But as the fight approached, it gradually stepped on continually thinning ice. In February 2016, John was stopped by the police while he drove 75 miles per hour in a 35 zone, without proof of insurance, vehicle registration, or even his driver's license. Despite him claiming ignorance to every question he was asked, he was miraculously let go without even a write-up. 1 month later, another traffic violation happened, and this time, Jones wouldn't be so lucky. On March 25th, he was stopped again for drag racing, exhibition driving, weaving, failing to properly display his license plate, and modifying his exhaust pipe. Video of the incident showed John being uncooperative with the cop, going as far as insulting him for stopping him over the traffic citations. Again, by some miracle, these were not seen as violations of his parole, and the fight was still on. Unfortunately, DC suffered a foot injury in the same month the fight was supposed to happen, and was replaced by Vince St. Pro. In a fight he recalls as his worst performance ever, John still won by unanimous decision, though he seemed more tentative with his offense than ever, which he chalked up to not having partied prior to this fight. DC was commentating on it, and as soon as John stepped off the octagon, he flipped DC off. Just like that, his rivalry against Cormier was back on track, slated to come to a head on UFC 200. Just 3 days before the bout took place, however, John tested positive for 2 banned substances. Though he arduously claimed to not be a cheater and to be strictly against performance enhancers, the only proper explanation he ever provided was that he took off-brand Cialis pills that happened to be tainted with the substances. To this day, many don't believe him, but after John provided said pills to USADA, they were tested and matched to what Jones had in his system. He was promptly declared innocent of any cheating, having taken the substances on accident, something he was happy about considering he cried during a conference over the prospect of being seen as a PED user. Another person who was extremely upset about John having tested positive was none other than Daniel Cormier himself. In a video of Dana White breaking the news to him, DC is seen offering to sign a release to fight John, even if he's proven to be on substances.
Dana, come on. Come on.
I'm so sorry.
Come on. Like, is there anything I can do? Like, I'll sign the release and we can just fight. Can't do it.
An underexamined facet of their conflict with each other is how John's carelessness with his legacy inadvertently affected DC's. What with their many canceled or postponed fights and the speculations that John was on PEDs during their first match. Overall, Daniel just wanted to be done with it. Regardless, John was still suspended for 1 year, being replaced with Anderson Silva in UFC 200, who lost to DC via unanimous decision. Jones took this suspension in a much more transparent and light way than the last one, even engaging in some fighting outside of the UFC and MMA umbrella, such as a grappling match against Dan Henderson. People expressed doubt as to whether Jones would ever be able to get back in the zone he was in prior to 2015, not only in regard to staying out of trouble and being a champion and elite athlete, but being someone reliable enough to work with that companies would want to sponsor. Dana White, for example, said he would never take the risk of having a Jones fight be the headliner of an event unless he was certain John wouldn't screw it up. But as tensions died down and John's suspension came to an end, Jones vs. Cormier 2 was being considered once again, this time for July 29th in UFC 214. But before it could take place, tragedy struck. Camille Jones, John's mother, died at 55 years old due to diabetes. And despite the two being in the throes of the pre-fight promotion, DC made it a point to step outside of the competition and give John his condolences. This break and the otherwise incessant conflict between them was a nice change of pace. Overall, despite them still disliking each other, there were hints that it was getting tiresome for both of them to continue antagonizing the other, which is understandable since it had been years since their beef beef began. Fight night came, and once again, like their first fight, it was competitive, with Jones having an advantage in the first round, but DC taking the lead in the second with some impressive boxing, including one shot that blew the mouthpiece right out of Jones's mouth. However, in the third, after landing multiple leg kicks to get DC to expect more, John landed a devastating head kick followed by a leg sweep, which completely disoriented him. Once Jones closed in, the knockout was secured, and John had become the UFC light heavyweight champion for the second time, though some argue he just retained his title. The fight concluded with some pretty emotional moments, with Joe Rogan admittedly screwing up and interviewing DC after he'd been knocked out.
Daniel, give us your thoughts right now.
I don't know, man. I thought the fight was going well. I don't even know what happened. It's like I got kicked in the head. Oh, man, I'm so disappointed.
I don't think it's a good idea to interview fighters after they've been knocked out, but I really wanted to give you a chance to express yourself. I know this was an incredible moment for you. It was very emotional. What can you say at all about this and the rivalry between you and John?
If you win both fights, there is no rivalry, so I don't know.
Thank you for everything, Daniel. Daniel Cormier, ladies and gentlemen.
John's post-fight interview also seemed like one of the most candid and transparent moments he's ever had in his career. After speaking about overcoming the hardships he'd recently struggled with that almost cost him his livelihood, he went out of his way to congratulate DC.
I want to take this time to thank Daniel Cormier for being my biggest rival and motivator. Daniel Cormier, guys, he has absolutely no reason to hang his head. He has been a model champion, a model husband, a model father, leader, and I aspire to be a lot more like that man because he's an amazing human being.
Some people say this was John feigning sympathy and pity to get back in people's good graces, especially since, long after his fight, he still makes the odd offhand remark belittling Daniel Cormier. However, I doubt that this was the case, as at least during the moment, he seemed very genuine. And thus, John was the champion for 1 month. In late August, it was revealed that John had failed a drug test he did one day prior to his match, and this time, there was no excuse. Unlike the last time when Jones just tested positive for a banned substance, this time he tested positive for a steroid, turinabol. In September of the same year, his fight against DC was ruled a no contest, and he was, for the third time, stripped of his title, with it being returned to Daniel. While he initially faced a 4-year-long suspension if found guilty, he got it down to 15 months of suspension and 3 of community service after providing substantial assistance to USADA. In other words, he snitched on other fighters who were using performance-enhancing drugs. That talk of his from a decade ago, talking about how we like to tell on other people, really stayed true. Regardless, the trust he had been working to build since his 2015 hit and run evaporated, with DC saying he made a mockery of the sport and Dana White referring to him as unfixable, saying, "I just think that John likes to party and he's a guy that likes to go out and have fun and do whatever it is that he does, and I think the money and the fame made it 1,000 times worse. I'm not sitting here acting like Mr. Holier than thou. We've all gone and had fun and probably partied a little too much here and there, but he consistently kept doing it. Even when he would completely up, he would pull himself together and come out and completely fuck up again. Even this last time when he came back, fans forgave him and he was the most popular fighter and everybody wanted to see this guy succeed, and he did it again. It's just unbelievable." In December of that same year, John's suspension was lamented by Alexander Gustafsson, who still, after everything, thought he deserved a rematch, though the prospect of such a fight seemed increasingly unlikely since John had his MMA license revoked and was fined over $200,000 for his drug use during the second Cormier fight. In July of 2018, John took to Instagram to express that once his suspension was up, he intended to return to the octagon. This sentiment was instantly reflected by Daniel Cormier, who expressed his desire to fight John again, this time in the heavyweight division, since DC moved back into it, and ideally without the involvement of PEDs. However, despite Dana and DC's interest in the trilogy, John said the following: "I already have all the marbles when it comes to Daniel Cormier. I'm not the one who went home crying the first and second times we fought. That was him. There's nothing inside of me that wants to take things from him or make his life harder in any way. I just want what's rightfully mine. He can have what's rightfully his, and we can all get along." In addition to categorically denying the claims he snitched on other athletes, without providing an alternative explanation as to what he gave the USADA in order to lower his sentence, John confirmed he would continue to fight for the light heavyweight title, which DC had been stripped of after moving to heavyweight. This meant that Alexander would be getting his rematch after all, in December of 2018, just 2 months after John's suspension wore off. But John wasn't satisfied with being allowed to once again go straight back to a title fight and complained that he wasn't immediately ruled the champion by USADA, saying, "A part of me feels like I shouldn't even have to fight for the belt against Alexander Gustafsson because I was proven innocent. In a way, the belt was never his in the first place. He was given the belt." John and his team, after all of the rulings, remained steadfast in the defense of his innocence, that the turinabol was taken on accidents, and that some malicious third-party intent on sabotaging John's career dosed him. Supposedly, John was paranoid about going to restaurants and feared fear that an unhinged waiter would give him steroids, an idea that was widely mocked by other MMA fighters like Colby Covington, who pointed out the unlikeliness of a restaurant having steroids at hand just to give to John. Nevertheless, as the PED controversy died down and the fight approached, the attention was solely on whether John would perform or not. To say that this fight was very different from the last one would be an understatement. Whether because John was partying a week prior to the first fight and didn't properly prepare, or because his ego got in the way of preparation and made him believe he would win no matter what, or because he was on PEDs and trusted that his raw strength and energy would win him the bout. In the first fight, John seemed careless about playing to his strengths, resulting in an excruciating war. The second fight, however, was a much different story. John never allowed Alexander to get in the distance and rhythm of the boxing that dealt so much damage to him in the first fight. Instead, the fight was taken further and further into the umbrella of wrestling, with strategically placed strikes to weaken Gustafsson takedown defense, culminating in total domination by Jones and a ground and pound technical knockout in the third round. While drug tests did still find trace amounts of the same drug that got Jones suspended in the first place, it was determined to be the result of a long-term pulsing effect and not due to continued use, so Jones was allowed to keep his belt. For a while, Jones's fighting was the only thing that captured the people's attention, as he went on to prove that PEDs weren't what made him a champion. In 2019, he defended his title against contender Anthony Smith, who had been promising he'd found the holes in Jones's game and planned on capitalizing on them. Initially, this was a very interesting matchup, since in his professional career alone, Smith had a total of 40 fights, of which he won 27, a very impressive feat for someone a year younger than John. However, when it came to the actual fight, it was a brutal display of Jones's superiority in the octagon. Over the course of 5 rounds, of which John won all 5, Anthony was outclassed by Jones's striking, with no need to rely on his wrestling. While it was surprising to see someone as tough as Anthony be beaten this badly with such ease, it looked like Jones had found his groove and went back to looking superhuman during his fights. With the exception of an illegal knee late into the fight, which got 2 points deducted from his score, it was an impeccable performance for John. However, his reputation as an unstoppable fighting machine was only temporarily restored, as a few months later, a much tougher fight awaited him. In UFC 239, Jones was slated to face off against Thiago Santos, a Brazilian former paratrooper nicknamed Mareta, which is Portuguese for the sledgehammer. Their fight was very kick-heavy due to Thiago having a background in Muay Thai. Much to the surprise of the audience, and probably Thiago himself, John didn't attempt a single takedown, and in trying to compete against Thiago solely in the striking realm, he absorbed a lot of very hard shots, with John saying he was the most powerful guy he ever fought. Though he ultimately won, it was incredibly close, as one of the judges scored it for Thiago, resulting in John winning by split decision. It's worth noting that Thiago suffered a leg injury in the first round, leaving many to wonder how the fight would have gone if he hadn't injured it. While things continued to be relatively calm in general in John's life, one glaring exception came right after the Santos fight. In the month of July, John was charged with battery for an event that allegedly happened months prior in April. Supposedly, John was in a strip club and had slapped a waitress, proceeding to put her in a chokehold and kissing her on the neck against her will. The trial was scheduled for September of that same year, and when the time came, John pleaded no contest, getting a 90-day-long probation where he was prohibited from drinking alcohol or doing any kind of drugs, along with having to pay court fees. Compared to his other run-ins with the law so far, this one was easygoing, and John didn't have to take any time away or focus from fighting. A month after his fight with Thiago, John reciprocated the condolences for his mother he received from DC, as when DC's stepfather, Percy Benoit, passed away due to cancer. John tweeted at him saying, "All beef aside, I'm really sorry about your loss, DC. Know that he's in heaven with the opportunity to watch you front row and center for the rest of your life. Continue living a life that makes him proud. Thoughts go out to you and your family today." In the same month also, John guaranteed that there would not be a third fight against Cormier, because he was planning on an eventual move up to heavyweight to secure a title in another division, and since DC had already moved back up to heavyweight, speculations had begun that they would once again face each other. However, a year later, DC retired, putting the possibility of a trilogy fight permanently out to pasture. After being stripped of his superhuman aura by Thiago, his next fight held even more challenge: Dominic Reyes, an undefeated contender 3 years younger than John. Once again, it seemed like John tried to meet his opponent at their strengths instead of playing to his own, as he engaged in a lot of striking with Reyes, which was a quite dangerous endeavor that could have easily cost him the fight. Even though he was already going for a takedown in round 1, John only looked to be winning the 4th and 5th rounds when Reyes was noticeably more tired, with the other rounds ranging from a toss-up to a Reyes win. While the judges scored it unanimously for John, the decision was quite the opposite of unanimous outside of the bounds of the UFC. Out of the 21 51 media outlets covering the fight, exactly 2/3 of them scored for Reyes, while only 7 scored it for John. Regardless of the controversial scoring, the judges called it a Jones win, most likely because when fights are close, they tend to go with the reigning champion. With this victory, John broke a record with 14 consecutive wins in title fights, and here John stood over a decade into his fighting career, but only in his early 30s. Definitely not that old for someone with a career as legendary as his. The only question was, what's next? Before the possibilities could be examined, John was once again in trouble with the law. Around 1 a.m. on March 26, a police officer heard what he thought to be a gunshot. When followed to its source, the officer found John in his car, visibly intoxicated. When he took a breathalyzer test, the results returned above twice the legal limit, prompting his arrest, which was caught on video. After his arrest, his car was examined, and a black handgun was found beneath the driver's seat, along with an open bottle of alcohol. He was charged for all of these things, as well as for not having proof of insurance in his vehicle. He was sentenced to 4 days of house arrest, a year of probation, 3 months of outpatient therapy, and 2 days of community service. According to John, he'd gotten stir-crazy from being indoors too long and decided to drive a little and talk to some homeless people, suggesting that he wasn't even partying and was just drunk for no reason. From the video, it's evident that he had no intention of harming anyone and was just genuinely in a bad place. Regardless of how many people may feel about him as a fighter, or his PED cases, no one wanted this for Jones. Addressing the situation, he said, "While we all work to understand and cope with stress and uncertainty surrounding the current state of our world, I want to express how truly disappointed I am that I've become the source of a negative headline again, especially during these trying times. I'm disappointed for letting down the people I care about the most, my family, friends, and my fans. This morning, I entered into a plea deal with the Albuquerque DA's office. I accept full responsibility for my actions, and I know that I have some personal work to do, which involves the unhealthy relationship I have with alcohol." Meanwhile, over in the MMA side of Jones's life, things seem uncertain. He had no interest in fighting Reyes or any other contender for light heavyweight, and though he played around with the idea of a fight against Israel Adesanya, it wasn't solid. By May 2020, it was made clear that John was in the mire of negotiations with the UFC for the money he'd make if he were to move to heavyweight to fight Francis Ngannou. Allegedly, John wanted the kind of money boxer Deontay Wilder was making, which was in the realm of tens of millions of dollars per fight. Whether or not that's true, it's been confirmed by John himself that he was dissatisfied with his pay. Dana and John went back and forth, and when no satisfying solution to the issue was found, John relinquished the light heavyweight title and announced he was taking a hiatus from the UFC. After the Reyes fight, John spent the rest of 2020 outside of the octagon because, as he said, he was willing to sit it out and weather the storm in order to get the contract he wanted. As you can imagine, Dana White was livid that his biggest draw in the light heavyweight division had left the building that unceremoniously, saying that John was the biggest waste of talent in all of sports ever. As 2020 went on and New Year's approached, any speculations about John being present in any way, shape, or form in the light heavyweight division were crushed by him, who said that he was strictly focused on going into heavyweight. But before his transition could take place without a hitch, John's old habits came back to haunt him once more. After the year began with a minor controversy regarding Jones killing a bear, it was months of relative silence on John's end. Having gotten up to the weight necessary to fight in heavyweight and successfully attracting the attention of the division's top 10, the only thing standing in the way of a fight being made were his demands as far as payment from the UFC, saying that $8 to $10 million was too low for a fight between him and Francis Ngannou. But before he could secure more leverage with the organization, John's legacy was tainted with a terrible stain. In September 2021, just a day after he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame for his Gustafsson fight, Jones was charged with domestic violence. The police were called to the hotel room John and his wife were staying at, only to be met with her bleeding from her nose and mouth. She revealed Jones had gone out with his friends and returned belligerent, though she only mentioned John having pulled her hair, leaving the bloodstains conspicuously unexplained. Jessie, John's wife, seemed scared of John, and his kids at least had some awareness of what was happening, as they were the ones who told the hotel staff they should call the cops. When it came to arresting Jones, the already terrible occurrence became a humiliating nightmare of a situation. Video of the arrest shows Jones rapidly oscillating between being obedient to the cops' demands while crying and aggressively threatening them with lawsuits and violence while complaining that they're doing this to him on the most important night of his life, referring to his Hall of Fame induction. John told the police that he told Jessie he was taking $10,000 and going to a local strip club. Then he jokingly said he could escape the handcuffs, but apologized once the officers said they would tase him if he did so. The moment culminated in John proclaiming his hatred for the cops for doing this to him, followed by him headbutting their car.
I'm in prison, officers. I hate you. I hate you.
While it's difficult to empathize with a father of 4 who's being arrested for domestic violence, and worse, the fact that their kids definitely witnessed it to some extent, it's not hard to feel bad for how damaged a person John was. Besides the misdemeanor battery domestic, John got a felony charge for the damage he did to the police car, with his bail set at $16,000, which was promptly posted. 4 days after the incident, John took to Instagram to promise he would stay away from alcohol forever due to his brain no longer being able to handle it. After being banned from the training camp he'd been at since 2009, John briefly took to Twitter to mention that he had things to deal with, including having been molested in his childhood, something he had never mentioned before. However, he quickly deleted the post. His wife ultimately dropped the domestic battery charge against him, and after paying $750 in damages and attending anger management therapy, his life resumed, though in a diminished state. According to a tweet of his from early 2022, she had left him a couple of months ago and was not coming back. His training continued, and though he initially was aiming at either fighting Ngannou or Miocic in UFC 282 in December 2022, the event he actually landed was 285 in March 2023. His opponent for it was revealed to be Cyril Gane, a top 10 contender. After a contract dispute between Ngannou and the UFC, he was stripped of his title, which meant if Jones beat Gane, he would become heavyweight champion. Said and done, he took Gane out in the first round via a guillotine submission after a 3-year break from MMA. Despite how significant of a victory this was, it probably didn't mean as much to John as being able to walk in with his wife, with whom he had reconciled. I say that not only because his family definitely meant more for him than the title, but because Jones himself knew Gane wasn't the real champion, and Ngannou was only stripped due to a technicality, evident in the fact that Jones was still looking for a fight against Francis. Interestingly enough, Francis was in a similar position as Jones in regards to payment, as he was in talks to fight Tyson Fury in a boxing match. For no particular reason, Joe Rogan had one of the most brilliant moments of inadvertent fight promotion when he hypothesized a fight between Fury and Jones, and without specifying if it'd be boxing or MMA, claimed he would bet on Jones to win. This irritated Tyson Fury greatly, while giving John a wide berth to pivot into chasing after potentially the most profitable fight of his life, a hybrid match against Tyson Fury, which Dana White said he would make happen if Tyson was willing.
Oh boy, Tyson Fury out there claiming he gonna beat me up. I better back off.
Even after qualifying his reign as champion with the most wins, the most title defenses, and the longest winning streak of 4 years somehow, it still seemed that the brightest and most rewarding moments of his career were yet to come. As far as comeback stories go, few have more stellar ups and shocking downs than that of Jon Jones. Then again, few people have better takedown defense than Jon, so hopefully he keeps this momentum and can keep his nose and his veins clean. I've been Turkey Tom, thanks for watching, and until next time, leave me alone.